Psalm 91 contains some of the most absolute promises of physical and spiritual protection found anywhere in ancient literature. The text makes highly specific claims. It assures the reader that no evil will befall you, promising total immunity from deadly pestilence, the terror of the night, and the arrows that fly by day. It presents a picture of a perfect, impenetrable shelter standing firm against the violence of the outside world. But an immediate historical anomaly challenges these promises. Godly people frequently die young. Devoted, faithful individuals perish violently. This timeline charts Christian history, with distinct data points plotted out to represent widespread martyrdom and the physical destruction of faithful believers across centuries. Looking at this data, we have to ask a difficult question. Do these historical realities indicate that God is unfaithful and his protective promises are unreliable? A temporal misreading of the text's boundaries creates the appearance of a flaw where the biblical guarantee remains intact. Psalm 91 does not offer a literal guarantee of temporal immunity. Instead, it establishes a conditional framework for ultimate eschatological vindication. Look at the opening verses. The author defines God with the title Most High, designating him as the exalted ruler of the universe. The logical implication of this title is total supremacy. God is more powerful than the sum of all things, meaning absolutely nothing operates outside of his control. Examine this image based on verse 4. The author uses specific literary devices, attributing glowing wings and feathers to the Almighty, to describe an unbreachable defense. This anthropomorphism represents the profound peace a believer can maintain, without fearing sudden attacks at any time. Because the Most High exercises absolute control over all things, the believer's security is total, but it is bounded by God's explicit permission. This implies a believer is invincible only until the specific moment God intends for their earthly service to end. Thousands may fall around you, but no physical harm can touch the believer except what the Most High explicitly permits for his purposes. The text outlines absolute divine sovereignty over life and death. It does not promise an arbitrary magical field force. Moving to verses 11 and 12, the text introduces guardian angels, explicitly commissioned to protect believers from physical harm, even keeping them from striking a foot against a stone. This specific passage becomes the centerpiece of a severe theological trap in the New Testament, detailed in Matthew chapter 4. This split-screen comparison maps the precise textual overlap. Left, the promise from Psalm 91. Right, Satan weaponizing those words to tempt Jesus. The temptation demands a strictly literal interpretation of angelic protection. Jesus counters this. Claiming divine promises does not authorize manufacturing dangerous situations to test God. Contrast this dangerous literalism with how Jesus properly applies the psalm in Luke 10, when he sends the disciples out on a preaching mission. He references verse 13 to assure the disciples of God's sovereign care, but his intention is never to encourage them to act recklessly. There is a sharp distinction between moving forward in obedient reliance on God and demanding miraculous interventions to prove his presence. Claiming divine shelter requires submission to the promiser's will. Using the text to force a specific outcome for personal safety misses the author's intent. In verses 13 through 16, the structure of the psalm shifts. It moves away from describing God's power and begins outlining highly specific conditions for his action. This flowchart visualizes divine deliverance. The text isolates inputs: loving God, knowing his name, calling upon him, leading directly to outputs: deliverance, rescue, and honor. The comprehensive security described earlier is structurally contingent upon this active relational posture. The closer your fellowship to God, the more he reveals and satisfies. The promise in verse 15 to answer cries for help connects directly to the broader theology detailed in Romans chapter 10. Romans clarifies that whoever will call on the name of the Lord will be saved. This New Testament connection proves the psalm is establishing an eternal principle available to all who call, regardless of distinction. The shelter of the Most High is activated by a continuous relational posture of trust. A recited incantation cannot substitute for genuine devotion. This brings us back to our initial paradox. If the conditions of trust and love are met, why do faithful believers still perish violently? Look back at our historical timeline. Evaluating only earthly existence, the promises appear to fail. But zooming out past the marker of the grave, we enter eschatological fulfillment. The guarantees of rescue, honor, and long life find partial fulfillment in this world, but complete, unbroken fulfillment on the other side of the grave. Constraining our theological math entirely to temporal earthly variables guarantees a failed equation. The account of the Transfiguration in Matthew 17 provides a concrete example of this continuity. When Jesus speaks with Moses and Elijah, men whose physical lives ended centuries prior, it demonstrates that life and God's presence extend consciously beyond the grave. This confirms that seeing salvation can occur outside of a temporal, earthly context. God grants ultimate deliverance to his own, even if he permits their temporal bodies to suffer and die at the hands of enemies in this life. The long life and salvation promised at the end of the psalm must be defined strictly through the lens of eternal life. The math of Psalm 91 operates flawlessly, but it works only when calculated on an infinite, eschatological timeline. History provides a final proof that God's protective promises are reliable. Examine this visual. Divine faithfulness acts as an immovable, heavy metal shield, providing an impenetrable defense for the believer's eternal soul. The resurrection of Jesus Christ serves as the ultimate preview and historical guarantee of this vindication for all believers. This future redemption connects to Isaiah 54, demonstrating the reality that no weapon forged against God's people will ultimately succeed. Earthly opponents may arise and experience temporary success, but their actions are ultimately ineffective against the permanent reality of the second coming. The Most High cannot be one-upped by anyone. Temporal bodies may fail, but through the eternal framework of Psalm 91, believers will ultimately behold his salvation and share in a completely indestructible life.